I'm making a video game with underwater mechanics. In this devlog,
Leaderboard system revamp. Feedback fixes. Fourth world tiles. New enemies. First level. My leaderboard system would sometimes throw a custom service not loaded exception in certain parts of the game, but I was having a hard time tracking it, so I knew I'd have to rework that eventually. Someone in a Discord server asked me for my experience using the Steamworks asset since they were evaluating a different asset on sale. Eventually my experience convinced them to just purchase the asset. I browsed through the asset's documentation and ended up purchasing the Heathen Toolkit as well. My leaderboard usage is scattered around a few components, so I made a checklist in Trello to tackle each piece in isolation. I read through the options provided, and based on how I was going to replace the underlying calls for my leaderboard manager, I ended up using the leaderboard data object. I started by making a button that would fetch the same board data through the API. Retrieving one board was simple. Retrieving multiple at once gave me problems because I didn't properly account for errors in my callbacks. Fortunately, the asset publishers are very helpful and super responsive. After a bunch of back and forth, we discovered what my problem was. Thanks to all of Loden's help, I was able to replace the leaderboard usage when retrieving the current scores in the map. This no longer has the random service not loaded error. With that out of the way, I proceeded to tackle the more complex part of the game, orchestrating downloads and uploads after a level completion. Part of the complexity I created involved waiting for both results to download and then orchestrate uploads. These uploads need to wait for each other based on the Steam API. Since the Heathen asset handles the queuing for me, I can simplify my calls and deal with each board in isolation. I created a testing board for the test level in order to set up downloads and uploads. Downloads were easy since I had already done them for the level selection map. Then I wrote code to upload a score against that test board, which worked great. Since my score screen displays different states based on the results, I tested that the behavior hadn't changed with a new Heathen result object. I tested that a user without a rank displayed properly, a rank change displaying properly, and no change displaying properly. Then I copied the code and also made it work for the time boards prior to cleaning it up. I encapsulated these actions in an operation class tailored to each board type and realized they were fairly similar except for a few parts. I refactored those into a common class that just takes callbacks and a board name, and the code is much cleaner. The final piece I changed was the leaderboard UI, which displays all 4 boards. Like the previous feature, this also required orchestrating 4 different calls to the same Steam API. Learning from the prior lesson, I created another operation class to handle downloading the global and friend leaderboard for a specific board type. I also implemented the fallback when you don't have a score on the board. You still get the global top 8. All in all, I can recommend this asset if you're going to be doing Steam-related operations. This month, I ran another playtest with a few Discord members and some Reddit volunteers. From their feedback, I added about 50 new tasks. I'll slowly work through it while I also make progress on the content side. The first major update was making the chest drop consistently. I originally intended this to be a feature so a player could stop boosting before getting hit to not drop the chest. Most of the playtest videos I watched had an instance where the player didn't drop the chest while getting hit, and every player considered it a bug. This expectation convinced me I was wrong and the chest should always drop consistently. Another minor chest related problem was that they can be hidden by certain preps, due to the layer sort order I have. This was also an easy fix, just swap the sort layers in my settings and the chest should always be on top. Other chest-related feedback involved the throw mechanic. Previously, when I tried to implement throw via physics, I ran into problems with the throw would push you through a wall. When I fixed the clipping bug before, I added code that detaches the chest from the player and places it at an offset. Since the chest no longer touches the player, throwing it from this position does not push the player, which is the problem I wanted to avoid. There are still some scenarios where you can clip through walls, but I won't intentionally design levels this way. A few of the pieces of feedback I received indicated the game felt too zoomed in. I don't think I noticed this since I don't often play the game in full screen. I tried the game in full screen and noticed that I moved my head backwards a bit, which I hadn't realized. When I first made the game, I set up my art based on a 320 by 180 resolution. So I took the pixel perfect asset to different resolutions and got feedback on which zoom level felt right. I personally like the 480 by 270 reference, but that resolution won't scale perfectly to the other resolutions. In order to avoid a remake of the art assets, I tried playing around with the orthographic settings of the Cinemachine camera. I tried various orthographic settings and some damping levels. I later found out that pixel perfect doesn't work well with damping and pixel snapping and was the cause of random jitters I noticed when holding a chest. I settled for orthographic size 8, which had a very similar zoom to the 480 by 270 reference resolution. I played around with pixel snapping, since it should scale correctly when using a lower resolution than 1920 by 1080. However, that gave me some non-smooth movement. On lower resolutions, there's the pixel missing lines I used to get in certain levels. I opted to go for smoother movement over support for lower resolutions at the moment. There's some potential fixes I found to the lower resolutions problem that I'll try in the future. The tutorial needed some minor updates as well. The first issue pointed out was the hint text not hiding when you use the map, so it makes the game not feel paused. I fixed this by listening to the input system for the map action, and showing or hiding the text depending on state. One of the playtesters mentioned struggling with the slow movement. After asking them for more details, they revealed they didn't think to boost while carrying a chest. I updated the tutorial to include a hint about that mechanic. Playtesters were confused about the health bar being empty and the player not dying and considered it a bug. I initially designed it this way to add to the tension of the last life. The first idea I had was to update the icon to a cracked version. This still didn't seem clear enough. I kept the icon and played around with having the last health bar blink to draw attention to it. I played a bit with intervals and how long the alpha values would go. Eventually, I settled for a 0.3 second interval that kind of aligns to the character's breathing. One final tweak I made was lowering the length of the health draining animation, since players thought the draining rate was some sort of poison mechanic. Someone suggested I also try post-processing effects. After Googling a bit, I noticed I'm using the built-in pipeline, so I might have to make some time to upgrade to another render pipeline. World 1 Level 1 had a stalactite that would damage you if you were hugging the wall. This trap moved a little bit to the left so its collider doesn't overlap the tile. Another thing I noticed from playtests was that the levels being locked was not obvious. I used this opportunity to remake the lock icon and also add it near the anchor, opposite the level number. The location came from a suggestion for adding an indicator for levels being complete or not. The map also had a bug that would let you select other levels while a level is loading. This was an easy fix. I just set every button to not be interactable once the level is loading. I might add some bubble animations or a panel to better indicate the UI isn't frozen due to a bug. The fourth world is based on underwater ruins, similar to Atlantis. For this world, I want to try to not have diagonal tiles and make things out of blocks. We'll see in future devlogs if I succeed. Since these are bricks, I try to make the tiles by laying out squares, like one would with bricks. The first version that lined up properly was 4 tiles wide, instead of the usual 3. I took the same idea and tried to fit it into 3 tiles wide, but I consistently had problems with the symmetry and repeatability of the middle tile. The symmetry problem reminded me of how I tried to solve it when doing the shipwreck tiles, so I had another idea to take that tile set and fill in bricks inside it. I consistently tested the symmetry as I laid down other bricks, since the middle tile will be repeated. With a symmetrical gray pattern, I tried a different set of bricks that would grow from the outside instead of having sizes that didn't seem very logical. Eventually I got a preliminary set of tiles that tiled decently, even though the colors weren't very good. Afterwards, I worked on making the inner tiles. I tried doing it the way Adam Yunus does it, but something about the bricks really confused me, so instead I set up the missing corner and filled in the details. I played around a lot with color variations and ended up with a gray outline and green filler. I showcased this for feedback and got a suggestion to ensure it didn't feel too busy in the game. I imported this first version of the tiles and generated the physics shapes, using the same dimensions as always. Then I set them up in the interactions view to ensure I got the physics shapes right. The first enemy I wanted to add to the world would offer a platform area similar to the jellyfish, but would deal damage horizontally. My inspiration for this enemy came from Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Since this enemy will go from wall to wall, I played around with sprite masks and a setup that would hide the enemy once it went past a point. Then I figured out how I was going to make part of the body do damage and part of the body be a platform. This enemy will behave sort of like an arrow trap being launched by some contraption inside a wall, so I worked on also figuring those mechanics out. My first version used instantiate and destroy, which had the unintended side effect of deleting the player if they hadn't dismounted in time. I added a safeguard that gets called before the destroy event to force detach the player from the platform. Another problem I ran into was being pushed through the level by the trap when taking damage. Since my setup was using 2 game objects, one for the tip and one for the body, collisions are only disabled on the tip, so the body can still push you through. I created a mechanism for the damaging collider to notify the parent object. Then the parent object disables collisions between the player and the other non-trigger colliders. With these systems set up, I tested the prototype and checked that taking damage and then becoming attached to the platform would not drag you through the wall. Finding references for the Quetzal was tricky. Fortunately, my brother had a mini statue of one and sent me a few pics. I spent a bit in Sprite and made a shape I liked, which I used as a base. I played around with a few colors and asked around for some feedback. The feedback was that the color and shape looked a bit too much like a body part, so I went back to the drawing board. A Discord friend, Hooch, who does great art, played around with the shape and made a much friendlier looking axolotl. I took some other art as a reference and may ask him to make an axolotl as a prop, on a smaller scale. I imported the updated enemy and edited its physics shape in the sprite inspector. I also set up the trigger area and body collider. I created some decorations that work as the gates where the Quetzal enters and exits the level. While working on this, I also found a quirky effect of cloning the platform that caused me to also clone the player. I'm surprised the systems handled multiple copies of the player this well. Since the Quetzal trap goes side to side, I wanted a simple spear-like enemy I could use on the floors and walls. I drew a few ideas and used a shark tooth as inspiration for the shapes. The spear tip will hide inside a base and pop out a bit at some interval. I also want to make a version of it that moves in a circular pattern in the future. The first level is based on a sketch that resembles the insides of some pyramid. Following the usual level pipeline, I started by blocking out the shape. Then I checked the distance to the chest and back, and adjust based on the defined metrics for a level with one chest. With the shape in a good state, I'll start laying out the traps. Since these are more complex and I have the enemy palette, I don't use placeholders here. Then I play through the level in this state, adjusting trap parameters in sections that feel particularly tricky. During this stage, I found a bug with the Quetzal, which lets you attach yourself to it on the bottom. This felt like a cool feature to me, but based on feedback, others would consider it a bug. I updated the logic for the prefab Quetzal, so it behaves as players would expect it. With the traps and blockout feeling correct, I move on to adding the art, starting with the collider tiles. Then I fill in the non-collider tiles, using the mini-map camera as a reference for how far to paint sections. As usual, then I attempt a no-hit speedrun with the final art. Here's a high-level overview of this level. Since this is the first level in the next world, I had to update the map and set up the anchor group for this world. I also added the setup necessary to reveal the world when it should be unlocked. The dialogue part of this reveal mechanism will be added later. That's it for this devlog. My focus for the next part will be create additional levels in the fourth world, work through some of the playtest feedback items. If you want to support me, please visit the Don't Drown store page, link in the description, and add the game to your wishlist. Until next time.